This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by Rebecca Wynn Kelly, an artist whose work beautifully weaves together sculpture, storytelling and ecology, rooted deeply in the landscapes of West Wales. We explore how folklore, habitat creation and community gathering can reconnect us with the natural world, and what it really means to become, as she puts it, a species architect.
So my background is in art. I went to art school and studied art for a period of time. And then I ran a restaurant for 13 years and an art space in Cardiff. And now I've returned to art. So that's my kind of like professional background, if you like. And then my personal background kind of is based and rooted in Ceredigion. So that's where I grew up. And that is my kind of background of ecology, if you like. That's where I began my love affair, my enduring love for ecology and nature, because I live right by the sea and a forest and a river.
I mean, I can see why you would be inspired by that area. You know, it's all beautiful around there, in my opinion. Tell me about your current work.
So my current work kind of sits in a couple of places, really. It sits in sculpture, it sits in storytelling, and it sits in gathering. And all of these three areas of my work kind of come together. They're kind of coming together at the moment. So projects that I have on at the moment, I've got something called a Tŵr Gwyllt, which I've placed in a piece of land that was gifted to a local school. And that's a kind of totem tower, which speaks of, well, primarily it's a house, it's a home for the local ecology, and kind of on a conceptual level, it's a totem pole of mythology and folklore.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Is that what I refer to as the habitat structures?
Absolutely, yeah. So they're the habitat structures. That's exactly that piece of work. So that's very current. That's just been completed. So it's very new, and I've been kind of thinking about that and wishing it forward, really, because it's designed in such a way where decay and life... I'm just noticing the weather come in. Can you hear the weather
Can
coming in?
hear it, yeah. I saw you had your fire on as well.
That's kind of what it's like around here. So when you build these things, you have to build them to sort of last.
Wow.
The Tŵr Gwyllt. Yeah, so that's a new piece of work.
I'm intrigued to know, it's kind of dual purpose, isn't it? It's habitat, but it's also artistic expression, which, I mean, I don't know. Are many people doing that you know of?
I think so. I think a lot of artists kind of work in this place responsive way of thinking, you know, and kind of in relationship with landscape and ecology. But I think sort of where my work lies, or might kind of like stretch out into a different realm, is that I bring a lot of the local folklore and the mythology of the area, and how that kind of relationship with ecology and the land is in jeopardy. You know, when we talk about extinction of species or extinction of the land, along with that goes the extinction of the stories. So I'm a big river person. I've been protecting my river for a few years now. And it comes to light that actually the thing I really want to protect is that reciprocity of the people to the river and the stories that they hold, you know? So these sorts of things are woven into my work, and they're woven into that sculpture, that tower, which acts as a sculpture and also acts as a habitat for bees, toads, beetles, spiders, owls, you know? And in each of those animals, there's a deep connection to folklore. So the toad is often a familiar to a witch, and the butterfly, always this transformative creature, and the bee that lives between the underworld. So in Wales, we have an underworld called the Annwn, and the bee often is found in between the underworld and here in the human world. So it's those kind of connections between the magic, really, of nature and the storytelling, and how those connections and those threads between us as humans and non-human culture species, how those stories should be part of how we reconnect our relationship to nature. And that's what I try to do through my art.
Yeah, I love that. So is it your opinion that if we were to lose Because we are losing wildlife, the populations are shrinking, no doubt. But as we lose the wildlife, do you think that that is a contributing reason as to why we might be losing the folklore and the mythology? Or do you think that's just two things that are happening in tandem, but not from a causative perspective?
I absolutely think they're intrinsically connected, and we are all woven, human beings, the rocks, the sea, the sky. So that kind of intrinsic weaving of humans and nature is absolutely works in tandem. So, if we rediscover our stories and retell them and bring them back to life, then people grow to love what they see. So they grow to really enjoy the wild garlic. And then you find out that wild garlic was used in herb medicine and earth medicine by a woman who was a witch living on the river here. So then you have this story with the garlic, and then it becomes part, and then you're in the woods, and then you're spending time in nature. I'm going off on a tandem here, but yes, they are absolutely connected. And I think what I'm saying is, there's science. So there's the science of ecology, but when you're in relationship with the land, it's like more like about a remembering, like a lived experience. So I think my work tries to like rebuild those relationships through like material, story, and gathering.
So from the gathering point of view, because I was thinking, when you were speaking then, we can encourage the wildlife, we can bring it back in to coexist with us. But then you mentioned the gathering bit, because I was thinking, if we manage to encourage the wildlife in, how do we then connect that to the stories? Is that where your art comes in? Or, is there more to it? Do we need to sort of have community involvement and I suppose like a sharing of knowledge almost?
I mean, I think the gathering part, we lived in ceremony with the land. Our ancestors would come out and celebrate the land through, Beltane or Samhain or solstices or equinoxes. And they worked the land, they had hands in soil, and they understood the seasons and the rhythms, and they kind of brought ceremony to those celebrations. And we've lost that language. We don't have this direct lineage back to how we used to be with the land. So I think we're at this really exciting point where, we can come to nature, and a sculpture like the Túr Gwyllt is a perfect example of how you can kind of build something and then create a new ceremony around that in order to gather at that place to celebrate the sculpture, but also, celebrate the fact that you've rewilded that place, or that you've reconnected with it, I suppose. So yes, something like the Túr Gwyllt is a great opportunity to bring people together, to gather around and like to become a focal point of storytelling. And, it's almost like gather people around a fire. To bring a focal point like a sculpture into the landscape can often give people the opportunity to look at it from a different perspective. And even if you don't know the words or the names for species, the things that you're looking at, people can have a feeling about being somewhere, the atmosphere of a place. And if we create ceremonies for the future and future folklore, we'll definitely find ourselves being closer to nature, and that our health and our mental health will be better.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, so how have you gone about researching the local mythology in your area?
So a lot of it, because I've lived here all of my life, these stories have been passed down generations. But I noticed, so when I had my restaurant, I moved away from here. So that was in Cardiff. And when I returned, I noticed that not as many people were talking about local folklore like they did when I was a child. So I've been on quite a long mission, speaking to local people, interviewing sort of fourth, fifth generation farmers of the land. And I've also been working closely with the Sound Archive of Wales from the National Museum of Wales, where, there are interviews about the folklore, the witch, the sailors. So, my local history is really important to me. So you'll find me in the library, or you'll find me kind of deep diving, talking to people. I like to do ethnographic research, you get the best stories out of the people. And there's something about when they tell them to you in the Welsh language that really takes you back into this sort of, back in time, really, into the old ways of bardic poetry, really, where people would sit around and listen to the stories of the land. So yeah, kind of trying to bring a little bit of that back. But yeah, the best way to research anything really is kind of walking on the beach or up the woods, and people will tell you the old tales.
And Jake asked me, so Jake Rayson's been on the podcast before, and he, I believe, has been working with you, and said how amazing you are and to get you on the podcast. And you mentioned the river that you've been supporting, and he mentioned a particular witch who lived by the river, I think. And I am not even going to try and pronounce her name, but it'd be good to hear a little bit about her.
Yeah, so the witch, Mari Berllan-Pitter. So she was a woman that lived in a small little cottage on the Esgair of the River Arth, so on the turning of the River Arth. And she kept a beautiful orchard that was fruitful and sensational and magical. So, a tale from her, for example, would be that, no one was allowed to go into her orchard and that people were tempted. And a girl one day kind of stepped into the orchard and was tempted by the apple and went to pick it, and it's clung to the palm of her hand. And in that moment, she just knew that that was wrong. And she felt that she needed to turn and run, but something in her body was preventing her from doing that. So out of nowhere, she starts walking backwards up this big hill and past the witch's house to the top. And it was only when she got to the top that she was able to turn and run. And it was said that that was the Rebia, or the witchcraft of Mari Berllan-Pitter. So there's all sorts of these kind of, and that also what I love about her story, and I think something that really gets my spirit going is that she had this intrinsic relationship. She had a familiar that was a rabbit, and the local people said that she would take on the form of the rabbit, and it was impossible to shoot the rabbit, so hunters would come from afar, and merchants that were shipping at the dock would come up and try to shoot the rabbit, but each time the rabbit would just evade the shot and come down her chimney into her house. And when they looked through the window, it was actually Mari the witch sitting in the window. So there's all of these beautiful kind of, how nature comes into it, and also what's brilliant about these stories in my research is you do find out a lot about how closer people live to the land, to their animals, to the seasons. I love it. I love the research.
Yeah, I bet I can imagine. But that sort of really resonates with me, because I'm very keen at the moment, and I'm sure I will be going forward, on the idea that, we've lost a lot of connection because we're not eating locally, and we're not immersed in nature because it's not there. So that aspect of the kind of, like you said, the orchard and the productive horticulture, and the fact that we're, relying on nature to provide for us, which we don't really nowadays. Are you focusing more on productive gardens with your work intentionally, or is that just, coincidental that you're working with the school garden and stuff? Is that important to you, I suppose?
I mean, I think education is important to the next generation, and this idea that people don't understand where their food comes from, and the restaurant industry taught me a lot about that, where food comes from, and also where I live. So there's livestock all around me, they're grazing the fields behind me, but if I wanted to eat that lamb, I wouldn't know where to find it, I wouldn't know where to shop for it. Whereas the stories that I read, the community held space for sharing meats and butter and milk. And so I think this idea of coming together as a community to grow again, even if it's on like a really minute scale, and that that the idea that we could feed this village from polytunnels, or that we would, that we could make that happen, is beautiful and magical futuring. But there's, the reality of that is overwhelming. But the reality of bringing people together on a small scale to tend to a edible forest that exists in quite a small space, it kind of activates a remembering in people of what it meant and what it means to grow together and eat together and tend to the land together, even if that's on a really small scale, like even if that's your house plants. I think that the act of doing that, like I say, is a remembering. And if we can introduce that back into communities, then perhaps people will have a more tender relationship with their food.
I think that I'm right in saying that you moved to London and then moved back to West Wales, but you're living like on the face of it, my dream life, because I would love to be able to kind of tap into my creativity and, but I know from speaking to people previously, it's not always that easy. But do you think that there is a kind of maybe a funding stream to be untapped? If we're talking, in more cynical terms around finance, if people look at land art and nature art as acts of conservation, do you think that that is potentially a way of just saying, okay, well, I'm not just putting in a pretty flower bed, I'm actually doing this, and it's incorporating art and something incredibly useful and needed?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. And I definitely think that art is always a gateway to deeper conversations about the world that we live in. And as far as funding's concerned, it's pretty bleak. And I would love to think that there would be a stream of funding available for projects where art and ecology bring communities together. And I think the most important thing, if that was to be, it's the longevity of these funding packages. So I think what I found a lot working around here, there'll be a pot of money and you'll get something going and it'll feel great and you'll mobilize the community, and then that money will run out or you have to apply for it again through a different system, so it's very depleting. So I've yet to find a funding body that is truly nurturing of its artists and its creatives. So still holding out for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I face that in my day job, and the way I'm taking a view on it at the moment is that the project funding can almost be like seed funding, and then off of that you then develop something that becomes more self-sustaining, because again, as much as it pains me to bring in the sort of business side of it, I think things maybe do have to become almost like not-for-profit businesses going forwards, because that's how we're going to sustain things. And actually, if you've got like a kind of benefit to the environment and to the people who are coming to that space, then that's, I suppose, where your funding comes from. But it's just something I'm kicking around at the moment.
Wales has policies in place, absolutely, for funding to be given to artists and creatives and communities that are looking out for the well-being of people in relation to nature. I guess we're just all in austerity, aren't we? That communities are suffering, society is suffering. There's not enough investment into local projects or kind of like UK-wide projects, because the infrastructure is kind of not there. I think there's so much learning to do. There's so much that we've lost that it feels like the only thing to do really is to reinvest and to rewild that and to restructure that in some sort of way that echoes or kind of projects a different way of living,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that puts me in mind of the river that, you were trying to support and advocate for. And that is particularly resonant at the moment for me, because last week I had an episode went out with Stephen Rutt, who's the author of a book called The Waterlands. And I was saying to him, rivers are so tricky because they span different sort of territories in terms of land ownership. And it's a very, very difficult thing to try and fix one moving part when there's so many other bits at play. Yeah. I mean, how have you found that?
Well, the River Arth is 25 kilometres long. So, when I started out my campaign to save the River Arth, I felt like 25 kilometres actually geographically was achievable. And then you get into the complications, like you say, of like this tiny piece of river is owned by this farmer, or this farmer is farming organically, but this farmer is way off, and these tiny pockets of sections along the river. And that's just getting the land ownership in place. And then you're working with, Dŵr Cymru, Welsh Water, and Welsh water policies and the government and local government, and, the energy it requires and the kind of spirit that it requires actually in the end is quite depleting. Because just with a 25-kilometre river, I ended up thinking, if I sustained this level of noise and protest and activism, there'll be nothing left of me. So I had to sort of switch that activism into something that I now called sacred activism, which is kind of showing up for the river and speaking to the river in a kind of more of a shamanic way, which is to sort of live in reciprocity with it and look out for it in a way that is manageable to me. And I think that, when I look around, I think lots of people are exhausted, under-resourced, desperate to make changes, and also just trying to find the energy to make those changes in what feels like a very unsupported and unnurturing arena.
Yeah, I think you summed that up perfectly. Talking about the river, so as gardeners, sometimes I think we tend to, not all of us, and there's so many people listening who are just multifaceted and interested in so many different aspects of the environment. But what I really liked about your work that you've been doing with your gabions and your driftwood, and I have to use this term because I absolutely love it, about being a species architect, which I think is just fantastic. And I think you should patent that and just run with it, because
Thank
everyone's going
you.
to love it. But, it's, you've brought in driftwood. So you're kind of bringing in the elements of the water, and then you're also putting it on land, and you're creating habitat for presumably, amphibious creatures and, airborne pollinators. So it's really great because it brings in all of those things and links them together. There's such a lot in it, and it's such a conversation starter that actually it makes perfect sense to put that somewhere where you are going to be in an educational setting, or, where people are going to come together, because it just kind of brings in all the elements which are all equally important.
Yeah, the elements are important material, it's kind of like the gathering of those materials. And again, it's that kind of that tenderness to being an architect to the local species, and this also, on a cultural level, I live somewhere where we've got a serious housing crisis because every other home is a second home and or an Airbnb, and alongside the animals of the area and the species of the area, the people are also without homes and places to be. So it felt really poignant to be building homes for toads and bees, and kind of like imagining like how it would be great if we could just build our own houses in this way without planning. Or, I mean, I know that's a kind of like dream place to be, but, thinking about what a home is to either a tiny spider or a person, the tiny spider within the driftwood, or the person sat looking at the sculpture, home is such an important phrase, a term. It's where people find their autonomy, where they feel safe, where they feel grounded, where they feel they belong. So yeah, it feels good to, like I said at the beginning, I'm not a gardener, but it feels great to be making houses for these animals, and somebody else can do the planting and I'll build the houses.
And the beauty of that is you just never know what's going to turn up. So you just put it there and things arrive, and if they're not happy, they don't stay. And if they are, you just never know what's going to rock up. So that's an element of surprise. But it's also nice because it means, although you are an architect, you're not dictating what lives there. You're just saying, I've put this here and, come make use of it if it's for you.
Yeah. And you know what? That was a really beautiful thing to notice, in fact, because, as an artist, you have normally quite a lot of control, not when you're working outside, but in a gallery setting, you control the light, you control the materials, what color the walls are. Where I really want to see the sculpture is in 10 years' time, when it's decayed and crumbled and transformation has happened and it's entangled and it's messy. And it's kind of very un-gallery-esque, that's sort of the thing that we're all trying to get back to, the kind of layers of nature and the messiness of ecology and how it tangles together. And like you say, things appear out of nowhere that are unexpected. And so I'm excited to watch it over the next few years and see how it grows.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What happens to it, because it's just a living, decaying thing. It just takes on a life of its own, I suppose.
Yeah, hopefully it'll take a life of its own on. And, the gabion, I use the gabions not only as a kind of practical structure, but also, I quite like the idea. So they've got a long life. So there's a 20-year lifespan on a gabion. But what's interesting about that is that, the materials within that will absolutely not survive 20 years in the form that they are. So they'll start to crumble, and then things will move in, and we'll just go with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I love the thought of it. So my final question is, what's next? Have you got any other habitat sculptures on the horizon? Or
Yeah,
you
we have. I'm working with a local school in the county. So with that project, I'm going to be working with the students and kind of really trying to start to imagine what kind of architecture these animals would love to live in, how they would thrive. So bringing the students into the design process and the research process and kind of seeing how that goes when I collaborate and co-work with some young people. And so I'm excited to see what ideas they'll bring through into this idea of a wildlife tower. And we've got another wildlife tower happening in a festival in Aberystwyth in the summer. And I've also just taken on a new studio space. So that happened today.
Woohoo, congratulations.
So, gathering of materials is really important to me. So I've got a storage unit and I gather and gather and gather. Most days of the week, I'm gathering something and it all goes up there. And I've been waiting for a long time to be in a position to take on a space and play with these beautiful materials and these found objects that all have a story of their own, that all hold like deep time and memory. So that for me is really exciting, a space, an empty space to take my materials to and play.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Becca for such a rich conversation about art, ecology, and the stories that bind us to the land. If today's episode has got you thinking about habitat creation, working with natural materials and folklore, you might also enjoy episode 53 with John Little and episode 301, The Wheel of the Year. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his Insect of the Week, but first here's a word from our sponsors, The Roasting House. Please do go and check out their website and support them if you can.
There's nothing like a nice cup of coffee outside on a spring day. Hello from the Roasting House. We're a small, family-owned coffee roastery based in South Yorkshire. We love coffee, but we're also passionate about protecting nature and trying to keep our footprint as small as we can. At the Roasting House, we offer delicious coffees from around the world, carefully selected from farms that use nature-friendly methods such as shade growing, soil conservation, and maintaining wild areas for native wildlife. We roast in small batches using an energy-efficient roaster and filter the smoke to remove carbon to reduce air pollution. Roasting House coffee is packed in home compostable packaging, and we know that it actually breaks down because we've tested it in our own compost heap and worm farm. Order at roastinghouse.co.uk, and if you mention Roots and All or the Insect of the Week at checkout, we'll send you 25% extra free coffee as a thank you for supporting us.
Myothropa florea, the Batman hoverfly. Such a cool name, isn't it? And the scientific community is often very divided on the fact that common names can be very confusing. So the English common name Batman hoverfly is hard to confuse, but there are lots of examples of insects where it's got multiple common names, and so there's been confusion between species. So it's always really important to know the scientific name, the binomial, the name with two parts. That's why I try to list that first and then say the common name if there is one. Myothropa florea, this is an incredible hoverfly, by the way. And Myothropa comes from ancient Greek, so the genus comes from ancient Greek as far as I can tell. And the best translation I could find was about a crowd of flies. So perhaps the fact that they can congregate. Florea, the epithet, is just fairly basic, that it can be found around flowers. That comes from Latin. This species is a kind of yellow hoverfly, one of the larger species. It's a good size, quite distinct. There is a fair bit of variability, so you can see slightly different patterns, different times of year, different generations, different parts of the country. Found all over, really, to be honest, which is good. So all over UK and Ireland. Black and yellow, quite distinct. And the key bit is the amazing Batman symbol on it, top of its thorax. Now, if you get a good photo, if you get a good look at it, it's very, very clear in many examples. And that's the one I've taught my son, Dylan, my 5-year-old. He, obviously just for the name, really, but he loves it. And it's really, really cool. It's quite an unusual fly. So it's got the larval stage, which is not only in this species. In hoverflies, there's quite a number of them that have larval aquatic stage. And the larvae look like what is described as rat-tailed maggots. So they're in stagnant buckets of water or in little hollows in trees where water's gathered. So you've got kind of humus and detritus and organic material mixed in with water. And this is where their larvae develop, and it's often quite an anoxic poor oxygen environment. So they've got this little snorkel. And yes, they're in the most, what many perceive to be kind of vile habitat, but this is something that I quite enjoy now. And I kind of learned to appreciate and love buckets of stagnantly water with leaves and grass clippings and all sorts in there. And they are also undertaking, evolutionarily speaking, Batesian mimicry. So they look scarier than they are. They look kind of toxic and unpalatable with their bright colours. So quite a few flies do this. They appear to be toxic or scary, so birds don't eat them. So many humans think they're wasps or hornets, and they're not. They're just flies. So a very clever bit of evolution there. And the term is Batesian mimicry. I would say this one is actually not just physical in appearance, but it behaves like a wasp sometimes. So they're quite territorial. And there's a few gardens that I know when they always congregate in the certain spots where the heat comes through, the sunlight, and they buzz around your head, pretending to be waspy. So in some ways, their behavior is more wasp-like than a wasp. So they buzz around your head. And until I worked out what it was some years ago, I used to get quite scared, like something's flying at your head, but it's actually just a hoverfly that looks like a wasp. So this is a bit of a naughty hoverfly, but a really cool one with a bat symbol at its thorax. So what more do you need to get into hoverflies? A territorial wasp mimicking bat symbol hoverfly with a rat-tailed maggot larval stage. I don't think I need to say any more, do I? So please do keep an eye out for this yellow and black hoverfly. Get some photos, get it on the apps, iRecord and iNaturalist, and tag me in.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.